All right, student journalists. I'm Robin Russo. I'm one of the professors who's a course designer here at the English 121 course. And I'm here today with a good friend of mine who works at the Wall Street Journal. So I will let him introduce himself.
Good morning, Robin. I'm Nick Tamaros. I am economics reporter at the Wall Street Journal.
Awesome. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that role means? That might be something that's new for some of the students thinking about covering such a specific beat. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about what a typical week, if there is any such thing, is like for you as an economics reporter, and what brought you to this current role?
Sure. My main responsibility right now and for the last few years has been to cover the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. They meet every 6 weeks and decide on how to set interest rates. They regulate the banking system, and they pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the economy as they decide what to do with interest rates. So my day-to-day job is to try to keep tabs on what they're doing, saying, thinking, feeling about the economy in order to tell readers what's going to happen, or what the main debates are right now in monetary policy, so that readers, students, retirees, investors, small business people can make the best decisions, the most informed decisions about, for example, whether it's going to be easier to get a loan, harder, more expensive, less expensive. What the Fed does influences everything from the value of real estate to the rate of inflation that we have, and so it's really important stuff. In terms of day to day, I mean, every day is different. We just had a Fed meeting yesterday, and so that was all consumed with getting the news, going to the press conference, trying to make sure you ask the right question at the press conference. Other days, like today, is kind of all right, the big news is passed. Now you're sort of taking stock of it, talking to a bunch of sources. What surprised you? What did you learn? I'm trying to think of other stories that aren't maybe, here's what happened today. President Biden announced his nominee for the Fed board. It's more kind of what's next in the economy, banking crisis, wherever we are in that moment. And how I got to where I am now is kind of crazy. I was an intern at the Wall Street Journal 17 years ago this summer, and I covered a number of things. I was a housing finance reporter for 5 years. That was kind of my first serious newsroom job. I had a couple of assistant level jobs before that, but in 2009, they said, all right, mortgage market's a mess. Go figure it out and write intelligent sounding stories about it. And so I did that for 5 years in New York. Then I moved here to Washington, and I covered the economy, kind of economic indicators, job market. I covered the Treasury Department and budget or fiscal policy. And then about 6 years ago, I switched into the job I have right now, which is covering the economy, but really through the lens of monetary policy and the Fed.
As sort of a follow-up to that, do you have, I know a lot of our students wonder about how much you need to know about what you're going to cover before you go into it. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your educational background. Did you have a background in economics, or was that something you
Yeah.
learned through the
Yeah, that's a great question. I took no coursework in economics, uh, and I somewhat regret that. But you kind of move on. I was a government and American studies major, so I did a lot of history and a lot of government. I remember when I was a student, I met an editor, a Washington editor actually. And she said, "Oh, go work for your college newspaper, learn as much as you can about the craft of journalism, but make sure you study something else too, whether it's biology or history, so that you kind of have a broader base of knowledge." I didn't know I was going to be a finance reporter or an economics reporter. And so I guess the point here is, I could have been a health reporter, and I also didn't take any biology classes. You learn a lot by writing just one story. I mean, there's kind of a saying sometimes we have here that, like, once you've written two stories about something, you're the expert in the newsroom. A few years ago, there was a debt crisis in Puerto Rico, and no one was writing about it, and the Treasury Department was sort of involved. And so they said, okay, well, why don't you figure out what's happening here? And after you wrote 3 stories, you actually learn a lot. You learn a lot by having to tell other people what's happening. I'm lucky because the Wall Street Journal, people will return my phone calls. They want to talk to me. But even in other jobs I've had before I worked here, you can figure out who will talk to you, learn enough, present sort of the main idea, analysis, news, whatever it is. And so you don't have to be an expert in what you're covering. In fact, I sometimes think the best reporters aren't experts in their field because you can ask the quote unquote dumb question, which is often the question everybody has, but is too afraid to ask. And those answers can sometimes just people tell you information and you're like, hey, that's the story right there. A lot of people don't know this. You're telling me it. I'm going to check with other people to make sure that it's not completely goofball. But so the short answer to that question is you don't have to be an expert. You can become the expert through diligent reading, reporting, interviewing, and basic tradecraft.
That is, I love the phrase, ask the dumb question. That's something that in my field of education, we are continually encouraging people to ask the question because I guarantee there's always other people that haven't.
And if you preface it by saying, I know this sounds like a dumb question, like you disarm people, like you immediately, they're like, no, it's not dumb. And then you kind of get through the fear of asking the question.
That's an awesome tip. So that actually does lead well into the next question I wanted to ask you, which part of this class we're talking about, how do you find or decide on what a good story is going to be? You talked a lot about there's sometimes being big events, but then you just mentioned that story with the Puerto Rico debt crisis. Could you give us any tips or ideas you have for uncovering good stories or coming up with how you find those ideas?
Yeah, that's so I think a lot of good stories are you're answering a question or you're exploring an idea, but it needs to be something that you can explain. You want to be able to explain what it is you're trying to do in a sentence. You're going to go to an editor and say, I want to write a story about why this banking crisis isn't over yet. Or, it may have a little bit longer, but you don't want to have to give somebody your elevator pitch. And if you're having to spend a lot of time explaining what the story is about, then you probably haven't really got the story quite down yet. So you're answering a question, you're explaining a problem, you're kind of you could explain a debate. There's a big debate over what should happen on this particular piece of legislation, and you can bring the case for and against it. But you're trying, I always stop and think, if I tweet out this story and I only have 280 characters because I don't pay $8 a month to have the long tweets. How can I get you really? I mean, people have short attention spans. They're on their phones all the time. They can click onto the next story if yours doesn't sound interesting enough. So you want to be able to kind of think about what is the interesting question, puzzle, dilemma, journey, debate, and go from there. And the ways that I used to get story ideas when I didn't have kind of this little section of the waterfront that I just have to cover is I would read other papers, local newspapers, blogs, and see kind of how are they coming up with ideas. You don't want to just copy other people's work, but you can always kind of see maybe what their thought process was. You can maybe re-engineer or reverse engineer. Well, how did this reporter come up with this story? And maybe I don't cover healthcare, but I cover, trade. And is there a story that's kind of like this on my beat? Profiles are always great ways, the people who are making the decision or the shopkeeper who's affected by the decision. And so you're going to just pick one person and use them maybe to tell the story.
Those are all awesome ideas. You led a little bit into this when you discussed things like social media and the need to drive attention. But another thing we're going to be talking a lot about in this class is some of the particular contemporary challenges that are facing journalism. We know it's been a trying time for journalism recently. From your perspective as a working journalist, could you tell us what you think some of the biggest challenges are in your role, particularly in facing journalism overall?
Well, I think the challenges right now are actually not that different from the challenges 20 years ago. It's really how to keep people engaged and present kind of straightforward, factual, unbiased, objective news. And so that's still the key challenge. I think that's been the challenge for as long as I've been in business. I think what's changed is just that people are consuming their news in much different ways. And, we have to respond to that. So it sometimes means different story formats or, just like the whole kind of architecture of the newsroom has changed. We used to be very print focused and very much around what is going to get printed onto the physical newsprint tomorrow. And that's not at all how we think about things anymore. We used to save our stories and we wouldn't put them online until they had actually run on the mashed up dead trees. And now we publish immediately, and then somebody comes through at the end of the day and it's like, oh, these were the most interesting stories from the online version, and then we're going to put them into the print. And I think in that environment, the bigger challenge is because of this need for speed, you don't get to wait until 4 o'clock to file your story and everybody's going to read it at 6 a.m. the next day. They make this announcement at 2:30. So you have to bring the best, most comprehensive story immediately. When you look sometimes at the traffic, which I try not to do because it can kind of warp what you're doing. But when you look at the traffic and when you see when people are reading your stories, they want to read it when the news is happening. Within 90 minutes, you're going to get maybe 90% of your traffic. And so the challenge there is to do all the things I was talking about before, bring the best analysis, objectively, but to do it very quickly. And so some of what's happened is you do a lot of preparation beforehand. You kind of can pre-write things, or you can just be more prepared. You have quotes in your notebook beforehand because you know that once it's news, everything's just going to have to unspool a lot faster.
Yeah. So you've been working in journalism for a while. So I was wondering if you could share with us one or two of your favorite stories or projects you worked on. Tell us a little bit about it and why you liked doing it, why it was an important piece for you.
Yeah. So actually, one of my favorite stories was just a feature story that I did within my first year here. So maybe the understory to that is just you don't have to have spent a long time to do something that you'll be proud of. And it was a feature story about this race on an American Indian reservation in eastern Washington state, where they raced horses down a very steep hill. And sometimes the horses would die. And there was a fight between sort of the animal rights advocates and the tribal leaders who said, this is just something we've been doing for a long time. We run this race. It's called the Omak Stampede. And so I just went there for a weekend before the race in 2007. And I camped out there, and, you just watch and you sit and you collect information. I filled up my notebook with all this stuff. And, the organizers were facing pressure to shut it down, but, I was able to write like for the journal, we don't really run stories that go beyond 2,000 words. So this was probably a 2,200 word feature story. And I was pleased with it because it was able to kind of bring the reader into, here's what happens. While I was there, it just so happened that I watched a race where a horse broke, a hip or something, and it had to be put down. And so like the action, like I didn't know that was going to happen while I was there. That action happened. You're able to write a story. It was, I tried to put kind of a full piece of the story together. Now, the backstory, I guess, is that, they had been the tribal leaders have been very sensitive to the idea, like, well, horses die at racetracks. Why don't you write about that? That we're not cruel and barbaric. And then the headline, which I definitely didn't write, was the race where horses die. And so sometimes you write like the most meticulous manicured story, but you're still going to get kind of a sensational headline on it. And that wasn't like a finance story, right? You wouldn't think of that as kind of in the sweet spot of the Wall Street Journal franchise. Other story, I guess, going more recently, I did a story last August. We're in this environment right now where inflation's obviously very high, and there had been a hope and a view by many people that it would be sort of a temporary phenomenon and we would get back to the world we were in before the pandemic, where inflation and price growth would be lower. And I just went and looked at a number of things that have been happening in the global economy that could make that less true. we went through this period of globalization that brought down prices because tradable goods became much less expensive. If you bought, baby clothes or electronics, toys, how much less these things cost than they used to. But if globalization goes into reverse, then maybe things will get more expensive. If you're a manufacturer and you have to supply things from different parts of the world because you're not sure if, trading partners are going to be as reliable as they were in the past, that builds in cost. Same thing with demographics. We had a lot of labor coming into the global labor supply from China and Eastern Europe beginning in the 1990s, to the extent that we have aging populations now, and so less available labor. Could that create a headwind to lower inflation? So I kind of took all these things together, and then every fall or every summer, there's a big conference of central bankers in Wyoming. And there's just a breathless amount. It's kind of like the Super Bowl of central banking. There's not actually much of consequence that happens at this conference, but everybody feels pressure to write about it. So I kind of took this story that could have run at any time and said, all right, this year, the big central banking gathering, the big challenge facing these central bankers, and I focused on the Fed chair because everybody is more interested in reading about a person than about an idea or numbers. So you tell it through a person. Jerome Powell's dilemma is, what if all the things that made his job easy in the 1990s and the early 2000s and the past decade, what if those things are not going to be with us anymore when we get through this, pandemic shock that we've had?
Wow. Two very different types of stories, but sound really interesting. And finally, before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add, particularly any tips or advice you'd have for people that are just starting out on a journalism journey?
Well, I think, one thing is, in hindsight, when you talk to journalists, it's like, well, they have a job and all worked out. But that's not going to happen to me. My story before I got here was I interned at a couple of places that, were not household names. One of them was called stateline.org, which is a news service run through the Pew Research Center that covers state government. It was a small newsroom. It was about 10 people. They had 2 interns every summer. Luckily, they were paid interns because they couldn't really afford to do a lot of unpaid work over the summer. But what that did was it helped me build a network. So both of my editors at that organization had been Washington reporters and editors, and they had a whole Rolodex of people they knew. And one of my editors there is the wife of the then Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. So she said, at the end of the summer, you did a good job. I'll make sure they read your resume. And, that was the only way that the Wall Street Journal looked at me, was I had kind of a body of work and the relationship. And so I think the challenge just is to find those relationships. And I didn't know when I took that job that was going to be kind of this amazing, door opening. But so, it wasn't kind of a well-known thing. And I have a lot of colleagues who have done similar things where they came in through a trade publication, like National Mortgage News is the publication that covers the mortgage industry. And you go from there to the American Banker, and from American Banker to Reuters or Bloomberg. And so, it sometimes you don't really know how it's going to work out, but there are ways through to just build your network, your body of work, to get, if you really want to go into a job in journalism, it is possible.
Awesome. Well, Nick, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure a lot of our students will be looking forward to reading more of your stuff.
Thank you, Robin.